My father owned three things when he died. A 1987 Ford pickup with a cracked windshield he'd been meaning to fix for 6 years. A toolbox that weighed more than most men I know. And a piece of advice he gave me the morning I told him I was going to start my own business. He looked at me for a long time the way men of his generation looked at you when they were deciding whether to say the true thing or the comfortable thing, and then he said, "Leonard, the only thing that will ever belong to you is what you build with your own hands. Don't let anybody tell you different." I was 24 years old, $400 in a checking account, a journeyman's license I'd earned working for somebody else's company for 3 years, and an idea that kept me awake most nights whether I wanted it to or not. The loan was $31,000. First Tennessee Bank, branch on Charlotte Pike, a loan officer named Gerald Fitch who studied my paperwork for a long time before he looked at my face. I remember the exact sound of that office while he was deciding the hum of the fluorescent light above his desk, the distant noise of traffic on the pike, the particular silence of a man doing arithmetic on whether to trust you. He approved it. I bought a used Chevy flatbed, a compressor, and enough equipment to take on small commercial jobs, parking lot repairs, warehouse foundations, the kind of work bigger companies didn't want because the margins were thin and the sites inconvenient. I took all of it, every job. I showed up before the client arrived and left after they did. I did the work correctly the first time because I couldn't afford to go back and do it again. The crew in those early years was 3 men. Danny Rourke, who I'd worked alongside at my previous company and trusted completely. Marcus Webb, who was 22 and stronger than anyone I'd seen on a job site. And a man everyone called Boots Theodore Callahan, who had been in the trades for 30 years and knew things about foundations and drainage that no classroom had ever taught me. We worked out of my driveway for the first 2 years. The truck sat outside my apartment complex. The neighbors complained twice, and I ignored them both times because I didn't have anywhere else to put it. By year 3, we had a yard on the south side. Gravel, chain-link fence, a portable office unit I bought second-hand from a surplus company in Murfreesboro. It wasn't much, but it was real. Something you could point at. I want to be honest about those early years, not because I want sympathy for them, but because what comes later only means something if you understand what came before it. There was a winter in year 4 where I paid the crew before I paid myself for 11 consecutive weeks. Danny knew. He never said anything about it, but he knew the way men who work close together know things without being told. One Friday afternoon, he handed me his timesheet and said, "Leonard, if you need to hold mine this week, hold mine." I told him I didn't need to. I did need to. I didn't take it. By year 7, Briggs Construction had 12 employees, contracts with 2 commercial property management companies in the Nashville area, and a fleet of 4 vehicles with the company name on the side. The loan from Gerald Fitch had been paid off 2 years ahead of schedule. I was 31 years old, and I had built something real. I met Diane Colwell at a contractor's industry dinner in the spring of year 10. She was there with a colleague from a property development firm, one of our clients, as it happened. She worked in their leasing department. 32 years old, with the kind of composure that comes from a person who has learned to think before she speaks, which I found unusual in a room full of people who hadn't. We talked for most of that evening. She asked about the work, the actual work, how decisions got made on a job site, how you managed men in difficult conditions, how you knew when something was wrong before it became a problem. Most people at those dinners talked about revenue and contracts. Diane asked about what was underneath all of that. I noticed it. I called her 3 days later. She told me on our third date that she had started a business degree at Vanderbilt years earlier and never finished it. Her mother's illness, the cost of the program, a job offer she needed to take to keep herself afloat. She said it the way people say things they've made their peace with, but haven't entirely made their peace with the resignation and the regret sitting in the same sentence. I filed that. For later, we married in the fall of the following year. Small ceremony, 40 people, a restaurant in East Nashville in a converted warehouse with exposed brick and timber ceilings. I told Diane it looked like a job site someone had turned into something beautiful. She laughed and said that was the most contractor thing anyone had ever said at a wedding reception. It was a good day, one of the best I've had. The years that followed were good in the way that doesn't announce itself. The ordinary accumulated comforts of two people who have learned each other the rhythm of a shared household. The shorthand of long familiarity. The quiet understanding that this is the life and we are living it. We traveled when the business allowed it. We renovated the house on Greer Road that we'd bought in the third year of our marriage, room by room over several years. Diane chose the colors. I did most of the structural work myself on weekends. 2 years into the marriage, I paid for her to go back to Vanderbilt and finish the degree. She was 36. 3 years of evening classes alongside her job. I adjusted everything around the scheduled dinners, weekends, the occasional trip I might have otherwise taken. When she graduated, I sat in that auditorium and felt something I hadn't expected. Not pride exactly, something quieter. The satisfaction of watching a person step into a version of themselves they'd been waiting to reach. She moved into a management role at a commercial real estate firm the following year. Better salary, better title, a career that had traction now in a way it hadn't before. She was good at it. She had always been good at it, she just hadn't had the credential to match what she was already capable of. I never thought about what any of that cost. It didn't occur to me to think about it that way. You don't keep a ledger on the people you love. We tried to have children for 4 years. It didn't happen. The doctors were thorough and careful and ultimately delivered the kind of news that lands in a room and changes the temperature of everything permanently. Diane took it harder than she showed. I knew this not because she told me, but because I paid attention the way she moved through the house in the weeks after our last appointment, the particular silence that settled into Sunday mornings when the neighborhood was full of the sounds of other people's families. I never once made her feel that silence was her fault. I believe that. I still do. But somewhere in the honest part of me, in the part that surfaced during the long nights after everything broke, I wondered whether I had given her enough of the other things. Not money, not support in the practical sense, the smaller things. Whether I had asked enough about what she was feeling in the years that followed. Whether I had been present in the way she needed or only in the way I knew how to be. A man who runs a construction company learns to read problems and resolve them. I was good at that. I was less certain, looking back, whether I had been equally good at the things that don't resolve into solutions. I don't raise this to excuse what she did. I raise it because it's part of the true story, and I promised myself I would tell the true story. The last years before everything broke were comfortable in the way that can mask discomfort. The house on Greer Road, the routines we'd built, the shorthand of people who know each other completely. Or think they do. There was an evening about 2 years before she filed when we were sitting on the back porch after dinner. Late summer, the light going gold over the yard. She was quiet in a way that felt different from her ordinary quiet, a quality to it I couldn't name. I asked what she was thinking. She waited a moment. "I've been thinking about what I've built," she said. "What I have, that's mine, not ours. Mine. I didn't know what to do with that. So I did what I often did with things I didn't know how to process. I told myself it was a hard week at work. I told myself she was going through something she'd come through. I changed the subject to something about the yard, something about the week ahead, and Diane let me change it, and we moved into the rest of the evening, and I didn't come back to it. That was a mistake. I understand that now. But I didn't understand it then. By the time Diane filed for divorce, Briggs Construction was valued at just under $4 million. We owned the house on Greer Road outright. I had a retirement account and a savings account I'd been building quietly since year 2 of the company. 25 years of building something real with my own hands. What I didn't know on any of the ordinary mornings I drove to the yard and came home to the life we had made was that the woman sitting across from me at dinner every night had already decided how she was going to take half of it, and she had been planning it for longer than I knew. The first thing I noticed was the phone. Diane had always been careful with her phone, the way most people are careful, not secretive, just private. Face down on the kitchen counter, no narrating her messages, no expectation that I'd narrate mine. We were adults in a long marriage. Privacy isn't the same thing as secrecy. But sometime in the late fall, something shifted. She started carrying it with her when she left a room. Not occasionally. Every time. Kitchen to hallway, living room to bedroom. She'd pick it up the way she picked up her keys automatically, without thought, as if leaving it behind wasn't something she was willing to risk. I noticed it the way I notice things on a job site. Not with alarm, with the quiet attention of a man who has spent 25 years watching for the detail that's slightly wrong before it becomes the detail that costs you. I said nothing. The second thing was the hours. Diane had always worked hard. Late emails, Saturday morning calls that wasn't new. But the evenings that started appearing in the fall felt different in a way I couldn't quite name. She'd arrive home after 7, sometimes closer to 8. Always a reason. A meeting that ran long, a client deadline. Something that pushed the day further than expected. The explanations were just specific enough to sound genuine and just vague enough to resist follow-up. One Thursday evening in November, I drove past her office building on my way back from a site visit in Brentwood. 7:15. The parking lot mostly empty. Her car wasn't there. She came home at 7:40 and mentioned a client dinner she'd forgotten to tell me about. I said that sounded like a long day. She said it was. We ate and watched something on television and went to bed. I lay in the dark for a long time asking myself the question I wasn't ready to make into words yet. I want to be honest about something. In those months, I didn't leap to conclusions. Partly because that's not how I'm built. I've spent my career making decisions based on evidence rather than instinct. But partly, if I'm going to tell the true story, because part of me was afraid of the answer. Not afraid in the way of a weak man. Afraid in the way of a man who has spent 25 years building one life around another person and wasn't certain he knew how to be something else. So I watched, and I waited, and I filed things away. The third thing was a conversation. A Sunday morning in December. We were in the kitchen, coffee, no particular urgency to the day. I was reading something. Diane was at the counter with her phone face down beside her cup, looking out the window at the backyard in a way that had nothing to do with what was in the backyard. I asked if she was all right. She said yes. Then, do you ever think about how much of your life you've built for yourself versus for someone else? I looked up from what I was reading. Sometimes, I said. Why? She shook her head slightly the way you shake your head when the real answer is too complicated for a Sunday morning. Never mind, she said. She picked up the phone and said she needed to make a call, and she walked out of the kitchen. I sat at that table for a while. I could hear her voice somewhere down the hallway, low, careful, the voice of someone who doesn't want to be heard. Eventually, I got up and went to the yard. I didn't examine that conversation the way I should have. I told myself she was processing something. I filed it with the other things I'd been filing. That was the last real opening she gave me before everything moved. I didn't see it clearly until much later. The credit card statement came on a Tuesday morning in January, regular mail with everything else. I opened it at the kitchen counter with my coffee the way I opened everything methodically, without particular attention. The charge was $340, dated 3 weeks earlier. A firm name I didn't recognize. I set the statement down, picked up my phone, searched the name, divorce and family law, Nashville and surrounding areas. I stood at that counter for a long time. The coffee went cold. I was aware of the sound the refrigerator makes, the particular hum of the house in the morning, the way ordinary things keep going while the thing you're holding stops you completely. I'll tell you what I felt, and I'll tell you it wasn't only shock. There was a cold wave of at first the physical kind that moves through your chest and down your arms and makes you aware of your own hands. But underneath that, almost immediately, something else, something harder and less forgiving than shock. Because standing at that counter with that statement in my hand, I understood that the question on the back porch in August, the phone she carried out of every room, the evenings she wasn't where she said she was, none of it was separate. It was all one thing. It had been one thing for longer than I had been willing to see it. 3 weeks. She had been sitting across from a divorce attorney for 3 weeks while I made her dinner and asked how her day was. I folded the statement, returned it to the envelope, placed the envelope back in the stack of mail exactly where I'd found it, rinsed my cup, set it in the drying rack. Then I stood in the kitchen for another moment. I thought about going upstairs. I could hear the shower running. She was still getting ready for the day. I could wait until she came downstairs and put the statement on the counter between us and say, "Tell me what this is." I thought about that for a long time. Then I picked up my keys and walked out to the truck. I sat in the driveway for 3 minutes before I started the engine, hands on the wheel, not moving. Something in me wanted to go back inside. Part of me was tired enough of watching and waiting and filing things away that a confrontation felt like relief rather than risk. Even a bad answer was still an answer. But the part of me that had built a company from $31,000 and 3 men and a driveway understood something more clearly than the tired part did. I didn't yet know what I had. And a man who moves before he knows what he has tends to lose things he didn't have to lose. I started the engine, drove to the yard, walked through it the way I walked through it every morning, letting the familiar rhythm of the place settle around me until I could think straight. Then I went into my office and called Paul Greer. Paul Greer's office on 2nd Avenue smelled the way serious offices smell. Old wood and paper, the particular quiet of a room where difficult things get decided without ceremony. He'd been handling Briggs Construction's legal work for 15 years. He knew the company better than most people in my life. I told him what I'd found. The charge, the date, the firm name, the behavioral changes I'd been watching since fall without knowing what I was watching. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Tell me about the business structure. Walk me through it exactly." That was the question, not consolation, not alarm, the question that mattered. I told him. The LLC formation from 25 years ago, a decade before the marriage. The founding contracts, the client relationships, the premarital years. Everything that predated Diane by a full 10 years of documented history. He made notes. He didn't look alarmed. He looked like a man sorting information into categories. "Come in this afternoon," he said. "And Leonard, don't change anything. Don't say anything to her. Don't move money. Don't alter accounts. You understand?" "I understand," I said. He referred me that afternoon to a divorce attorney named Susan Hartley. Green Hills office, 22 years in family law, the manner of someone who has heard every version of every story and remained unshockable. She shook my hand and said, "Tell me everything, and don't leave out the things you think don't matter." So I did. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. "I want to be straightforward with you," she said. "The premarital foundation of Briggs Construction is strong, but her attorney is going to argue the marital period appreciation 15 years of business growth inside the marriage. That is not a weak argument. A judge has discretion to consider indirect contribution, the stability a spouse provides while a business grows. We can fight it. We will fight it. But I need you walking out of here with a clear picture, not a comfortable one. Something settled in my chest. Not fear. Clarity, the same thing I'd felt standing at the counter with the statement in my hand. "What do I need to do?" I said. "Right now, nothing visible. I want a forensic accountant reviewing your complete financial picture before she files." She wrote a name on a card and slid it across the desk. "Robert Vance, thorough and fast. In the meantime, go home tonight. Act normally." She paused. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds like what needs to happen," I said. I drove home that evening and made dinner. Diane came in at 6:30. She set her bag down, said the kitchen smelled good. We ate. We talked about nothing important, a vendor problem at her office, a scheduling issue at the yard. The comfortable surface conversation of 15 years of shared evenings. I watched her hands on the table, the ease of them, the complete ease of a person who didn't know she'd been found out. After dinner, she offered to do the dishes. I said I'd get them. She thanked me and went to the living room. I stood at the sink with the water running and thought about how well I had believed I knew this woman and what that belief was actually worth. That was the worst night. Not the courtroom, not the filing, not any of the procedural events that came later. That Tuesday night at the kitchen sink, washing dishes for a marriage that was already over in everything but paperwork, that was the worst of it. I didn't sleep much. Robert Vance called Susan 10 days later with his preliminary findings. She called me at the yard. "Leonard," she said, "she's been moving money for 8 months." I set down what I was holding. 8 months. Not weeks. Months, the summer, the fall, the winter, every ordinary day of those 8 months, transfers moving out of our joint account while I ran job sites and managed crews and came home to the dinners and the television and the woman who carried her phone out of every room. "How much?" I said. 40,000. 41 transactions, small amounts, irregular intervals. Someone told her to be careful about patterns. I looked out the window of my office at the yard, Marcus on the flatbed, Danny at the schedule board, the chain-link fence with the Briggs Construction sign. "There's more," Susan said. "She's been underreporting her salary on the shared household budget, the spreadsheet you both maintained for years." Vance cross-referenced it against her actual employment records, about $1,800 a month short for the past 4 months. "She's making herself look like she has less," I said. "That's what it looks like." Vance is still working through everything, but what he has already matters significantly. I hung up. I sat in the office for a while, not thinking about legal strategy, thinking about that December Sunday morning in the kitchen. Do you ever think about how much of your life you've built for yourself versus for someone else? She hadn't been asking me the question. She had already answered it for herself. The papers came 6 weeks later. Susan called first thing Wednesday morning to tell me Diane had filed. The server found me at the yard at 2:15 that afternoon, professional, apologetic in the way servers sometimes are. I thanked him, put the envelope in my desk drawer, locked it. Then I drove home. Diane's car was in the driveway. She was in the kitchen when I came through the door, standing at the counter, not doing anything, just standing. She looked up when I walked in, and for the first time in months, something unguarded crossed her face. We stood there for a moment. I had thought about this moment. I had run versions of it for 6 weeks. But standing in the kitchen of the house we'd bought together and renovated room by room over years, looking at a woman I had known for 15 years, what I felt wasn't what I'd prepared for. Not anger. Something flatter and more tired. The particular weight of an ending that has been coming for longer than you admitted to yourself. I said, "You hungry?" She said, "Not really." I nodded. Went to the refrigerator. Started making something. She stood at the counter a moment longer, then picked up her things and went down the hallway. I heard the guest room door close. I made dinner alone and ate it at the counter. The next morning, Danny Rourke arrived at the yard before I did, which had never happened before in 22 years. He was in the equipment shed when I came through the door, organizing something that didn't need organizing. He looked at me when I walked in. "What do you need?" he said. "Not what's wrong, not are you all right. What do you need?" "Just the day to run clean," I said. "Can you handle Brentwood without me?" "Already planned for it," he said. He went back to what he was doing. I went into my office and called Susan. Susan filed our counter-response 3 weeks later. Everything simultaneously Paul Greer's corporate history, the 25 years of premarital business documentation, Vance's preliminary report on the transfers and the income discrepancy, all of it submitted in a single filing that gave Callow no opportunity to prepare a staged response. She called me when it was done. "Callow has it as of 9:47, she said. "He's going to respond, Leonard. This doesn't end because we filed." She was right. His counter-response came 11 days later. I drove to her office the afternoon it arrived. She had it on the desk when I sat down. She turned to a specific section. "He's challenging the premarital valuation. That we expected." She set her finger on a paragraph. "But he's found something else. In 2019, you refinanced the company's operational line of credit, $380,000 to fund the South Yard expansion and 3 new vehicles. Do you remember that?" "Yes," I said. "Callow is arguing that Diane was present for that decision, that you discussed it together, that her income during the transition period while business cash flow was committed to debt service contributed to household stability in a way that made the expansion possible, and that the business growth following the expansion is therefore, at least in part, a marital asset." I sat with that. The 2019 expansion had changed the company fundamentally. The additional yard space and fleet capacity had brought in 3 major contract relationships that drove the valuation from $2.4 million to just under $4 million. Callow wasn't inventing the story. Diane had been at the kitchen table that Saturday when I'd spread out the financials. She'd asked questions. She'd said, "Do what you think is right. I trust your judgment." Her income had kept the household stable while the business absorbed the debt. "Is it a strong argument?" I said. Susan didn't answer immediately. She looked at the document on her desk. "It's not a weak one," she said. "He's not going to win on the premarital foundation, but 2019 is a legitimate pressure point. A judge could look at that refinancing, look at what Diane's income contribution meant to the household during the cash flow transition, and find a marital stake in the growth that followed." It was the first time in the whole proceeding that Susan had said something was a real problem. I drove back to the yard and sat in my truck in the parking lot for a few minutes. I thought about that Saturday in 2019. The kitchen table, the spreadsheets, the conversation that lasted most of the afternoon. Diane across from me with coffee, asking the right questions, eventually saying those words, "I trust your judgment." She had been there. Her income had been real. Her stability during that period had been real. Callow had found the seam because a real seam existed. I had to give him that. I called Susan from the parking lot. 2019, I said. How do we handle it? Vance goes back through that period specifically. We trace every dollar what went into the business versus the household. What Diane's income contribution actually amounted to in documented terms versus what their appraiser is going to claim it amounted to. And then we argue that whatever she contributed to that period has already been compensated for across 15 years of the life you built for her. The degree, the career, the house. This is not a one-way ledger, Leonard. Callow wants the court to look at only one column, and if the judge still credits the 2019 argument, then the marital share of the appreciation from that period becomes negotiable, which changes the settlement math. A pause. This is why I told you at the beginning the appreciation argument wasn't something to dismiss. I went back into the office and put the rest of the day in. Vance worked through 2019 over 2 weeks. The picture he produced was more complex than I'd hoped for and more defensible than I'd feared. Diane's documented income contribution to household expenses during the refinancing transition was real but modest in dollar terms. The 3 major contracts driving the post-expansion growth had come through relationships I'd built over a decade before the marriage relationships that had nothing to do with Diane's presence or contribution. Paul Greer pulled the client correspondence and contract histories to establish the provenance of each one. It wasn't airtight, but it held. Callow came back with a settlement offer the week after Susan submitted the Vance 2019 analysis. His number was lower than the original filing, still too high, but lower. He was showing us the analysis had reached him. That he was recalibrating. I read through the proposal in Susan's office. The business share was still above what the documentation supported. The house equity division was fair. The retirement split was fair. It was the business number that didn't work. Susan waited while I read. I'll tell you something I haven't told anyone else. Sitting in that chair, reading through the offer, I was tired. Not physically the kind of tired that accumulates over 9 months of holding everything steady while running a business and managing a yard and driving to attorneys' offices and sitting across from spreadsheets. The kind of tired that makes a number on a page look different than it would have at the beginning. Part of me sat there and thought, take something close to this. Get it done. Go back to your life. I set the document down. The business number is wrong, I said. We counter. Susan looked at me for a moment. That's the right call, she said. But I want you to know if you took this offer, I'd understand it. It's not an unreasonable place to land, given everything you've been through. I know, I said. Counter, 2 more offers came over the following 6 weeks, each closer than the last. The third was almost workable, almost. It included a methodology for the 2019 appreciation that inflated the marital share beyond what the Vance analysis supported, and Paul Greer and Susan rejected it on the same grounds the morning it arrived. I called Susan after our counter went back. If she rejects this one, I said, then we go to a hearing. Diane rejected it. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning in April. Davidson County Courthouse. The evening before, I stayed at the yard until the last crew vehicle was through the gate. The spring light was settling over the yard in the particular way it does in Nashville in April, warm and long, the day reluctant to end. Danny came and stood beside me while I was looking at the yard. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You remember year 4, that winter when you paid us before yourself." "I remember," I said. "All 3 of us knew. Boots knew. Marcus knew. None of us said anything because that isn't what you say." He looked at the yard. The trucks, the equipment shed, The sign on the chain-link fence I'd put up myself with a drill and 4 bolts 20 years ago. But what you built here, you built it the right way. The whole way, start to finish. I just want you to know somebody knows that. I didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you, Danny," I said. He nodded once and went back inside. I stood there until the yard was quiet. Then I went home and tried to sleep. I drove to the courthouse alone. April morning, cool and clear. The Bradford pear trees along the street in full white bloom, indifferent to what was happening in one courtroom inside one building. I parked 2 blocks away and walked. I've always thought better moving than standing still. It's why I walk a job site before I make decisions about it. I was thinking about the Vanderbilt Auditorium. The particular expression on Diane's face when she walked across that stage, a version of her that existed independently of anything I had provided. I had found it beautiful. I still did, even now. That was the complicated thing about walking toward that courthouse. The woman I was going to face across a courtroom was not someone I had stopped understanding. She was someone I had understood too late, and not completely enough. Susan was in the hallway outside the courtroom, going through her folder with the focused quiet of a woman for whom courthouses are familiar rooms. She looked up. "Ready?" "Yes," I said. We went in. Diane was already at the opposing table with Callow beside her. Dark blazer, composed in the particular way of someone who has been preparing herself for a long time. I hadn't seen her in 6 weeks. She looked up when I came through the door. There was a moment, just a beat, where we looked at each other across the courtroom. What I felt wasn't what I'd been carrying for 9 months. The cold anger had been useful. It had kept me steady, kept me from making the mistakes that anger at higher temperatures produces. But standing in that room, looking at Diane Briggs across 15 years of shared life, what I felt was grief. Something older and heavier than anger. Grief for the version of us that had been real for 15 years before it wasn't. I looked away and sat down. Judge Patricia Wynne entered at 9 o'clock, 60-something, gray-haired, reading glasses on a chain. The manner of a person who has heard a great deal of human difficulty and taken each instance seriously on its own terms. She looked at both tables before opening the proceedings, the look of someone who has formed careful initial views from the written record and is now watching the morning confirm or complicate them. Callow presented first. He was better than I'd expected, and I had expected a lot. I understood what I was watching, 20 years of doing something skillfully, performed from the other side of a table. He acknowledged the Vance report immediately, which surprised me. Named it, described it, conceded the transfers. He was disarming the thing before it could disarm him. Then he framed those same transfers as the actions of a frightened woman who had sensed a marriage deteriorating and taken modest, imperfect steps to protect herself. Not fraud. Fear. I watched Judge Wynne's face while he said it. She was listening, not skeptically. Listening. Then Hargrove took the stand. Callow's business appraiser was 60 years old, experienced, credible in a way that came through the moment he began speaking. He had charts and documentation and a clear methodology, and he walked the court through the Briggs Construction appreciation curve across the 15 years of the marriage, a clean visual story of how a company worth $2 million had become a company worth $4 million, year by year, inside a shared life. Then he addressed 2019. He argued it carefully, and he argued it well. The refinancing decision had been a joint marital event. He said a risk taken by a couple with a shared household, with a spouse whose income had provided the household stability the expansion required. The $1.6 million in company value that followed had been made possible by a decision made inside the marriage. with the participation, however indirect, of both parties. Judge Wynn asked him 2 questions. The second one about how he'd allocated the contribution weight between Leonard's professional network and Diane's household support told me she had read the competing analysis carefully and was probing the seam between them. Callow closed by talking about Diane directly. 15 years, he said. A woman who had structured her professional life around the rhythm of a marriage, who had been present through the years of trying for a family that never came, who was not asking for what wasn't hers, she was asking for what was fair. He sat down. I'll tell you what I felt in that moment. I did not feel certain. I had walked into that courthouse with 9 months of documentation and 2 good attorneys and a forensic accountant's full report, and listening to Callow finish his opening, I was not entirely sure which direction this room was pointing. That is not a comfortable thing to say, but it is the true thing. Susan stood up. She began with Paul Greer's corporate history. 25 years of sequential documentation, starting with the LLC formation certificate, dated a decade before the marriage, the founding contracts, the client relationships, the premarital period laid out in detail, the independent premarital valuation. She placed it all before the court with the clarity that comes from months of organizing things that were already true. Then she called Robert Vance. 61 years old, compact, precise, with the bearing of a man who has spent 30 years in rooms where people try to find weaknesses in his work and have consistently failed. He walked through the transfer analysis without embellishment. 41 transactions, 8 months, $40,000. The Pinnacle bank account opened 14 months before the filing, before any attorney consultation, before any documented crisis in the marriage, before any reasonable window of defensive anticipation. Then Callow stood for cross-examination. He was methodical and targeted. He asked Vance whether a spouse setting aside savings in anticipation of a possible separation was inherently improper. Vance said it depended on whether the funds were marital assets. Callow asked whether the modest amounts could be characterized as ordinary personal savings rather than misappropriation. Vance gave a precise answer about the account's origin date and the implications of its timing. For a few minutes, watching that exchange, I was not sure who was winning it. Susan redirected. She asked Vance specifically about the account opening date relative to the first attorney consultation, relative to any documented marital difficulty, relative to any event that might justify defensive financial preparation. Vance answered clearly. The account predated all of those events. It had been opened in ordinary circumstances, without justification other than planning that predated any crisis. Judge Wynn wrote something on her notepad. Then Susan placed the financial statement on the projector. The document Diane had submitted to Callow's office, the one with the underreported income. Beside it, the W-2 from the prior tax year. Both on screen simultaneously, salary figures highlighted. The gap, $21,600 annually visible to every person in that courtroom at once. I watched the room. There was no sound, no movement. But something shifted in the quality of attention, the way a room shifts when a fact appears that reframes everything around it. The judge's pen stopped moving. Callow looked at the screen with the controlled expression of a man processing something he cannot change. He had known about this since our counterfiling. But knowing something in your attorney's office and watching it appear on a projector in front of a judge who has been evaluating your client's credibility all morning are 2 different experiences entirely. Diane was looking at the table. Susan said, "Your Honor, the financial statement submitted by Mrs. Briggs reflects an income figure inconsistent with her documented earnings by $21,600 annually." The court is asked to consider this alongside the pattern in the marital budget records the same underreported figure appearing across 4 months of shared household documentation when weighing the credibility of Mrs. Briggs's representations to this proceeding. Judge Wynne set down her pen. She looked at Callow over her reading glasses. Mr. Callow, the income figure in your client's submitted financial statement differs from the W-2 documentation by $21,600. I'd like to hear your client's explanation. Callow stood. He used the word inadvertent. He used the phrase oversight in document preparation. He was professional, and he was steady, and he was building the best available structure out of materials that had stopped supporting weight. Judge Wynne listened. Then she removed her glasses. I've reviewed the household budget documentation as well, she said. The same figure appears across 4 months of entries in the shared marital record. That is not a single oversight in preparation. That is a pattern. She put the glasses back on. I'll hear closing summaries. Callow sat down. He said something low to Diane. She didn't respond. She kept looking at the table. The ruling came that afternoon. Judge Wynne was measured, and she was fair. I want to say that because it's true, and because it matters to the honest telling of this story. She wasn't punishing Diane. She was applying the law to the facts before her. The pre-marital foundation of Briggs Construction, confirmed as separate property, not subject to division. The marital period appreciation subject to equitable distribution, calculated using a methodology grounded in the Vance analysis and adjusted downward for what the judge described as the conduct of concealment demonstrated in the record. The 2019 contribution acknowledged. Callow had found a real seam, and the judge had seen it. I won't pretend otherwise. A modest credit to the marital estate on that basis. Proportionate to the documented contribution, not to Hargrove's number. The house equity divided fairly. Uncontested, the retirement contributions made during the marriage divided fairly. Uncontested, the $40,000 in transfers folded back into the marital estate calculation and deducted from Diane's distribution. 8 months of careful, irregular transactions undone in a paragraph. The income misrepresentation noted in the record. Referred for further review. Not a fraud finding from the bench, but language in the ruling that left nothing ambiguous about how the court had viewed it. When it was over, I sat in the courtroom for a moment. Susan gathered her folders with the quiet efficiency of a woman for whom a good outcome is satisfying, but not surprising. Across the room, Callow was speaking low to Diane. I looked at her once. She was looking at the surface of the table in front of her, hands still, shoulders carrying the posture of a person absorbing the gap between what they expected and what happened. I knew that posture. I had been carrying a version of it for 9 months. I thought about a Sunday evening on the back porch, late summer light over the yard. A woman asking a question I hadn't known how to answer. I understood the question now. I had understood it too late, and not completely enough. But I understood it. I stood up, picked up my jacket, and walked out of the courthouse into the April morning. The Bradford pear trees were still there. The city was still running its ordinary business people, moving with purpose. The unremarkable machinery of a Thursday morning that had no idea what had just concluded inside one building. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment. Then I walked to my truck, got in, and drove back to the yard.